what we have, these represent model breaches. So this is where behavior has come up and it's been so anomalous that we've brought it to your attention, right? So it's breached our model of expected behavior. Now, we can very quickly jump that up. So say instead of the last 7 days, I want to have a look at the last 100 breaches, and say instead of model's highest score, so the most anomalous behavior based on the models, say I want to have a look at the most anomalous behavior based on a particular device, I can just very quickly change that there. The other thing that we can do is say I only want to look at, any threats that are above 50% anomalous. I can just slide this slider up, right, and drop that down there. So that's making sure that the things that are really pressingly urgent, really anomalous behaviors are brought to my attention before anything else. At the same time, if your risk appetite is much lower, you can slide that down to 20% or even to 0, and you've got a much more broad overlook of the anomalous behavior on your network. Right? But if we just jump back to the model's highest score, right? Worth noting as well, these are color coded the same way those cubes are before. So the warmer the color, the more dangerous it is. And this is really about giving you this real powerful, actionable intelligence at a glance. You can very quickly determine what you need to be looking at. So to that end, let's do a bit of an investigation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the model breach, and that brings up the breach log. I can see that 3 machines have actually broken that model. I'm just going to investigate this bottom one. So if I click the magnifying glass, a couple of things happen very quickly. Right. The first is it takes me directly to the machine that breached that model, right there in the middle. The second thing that happens is it takes me to the time that the model breach occurred. So up in the top right hand side, I can see that this model breach occurred on Friday, June 3rd at about 18 past 8. Right. Down the bottom right, we've got all this information, the statistical information about the traffic going into and out of that device at that time. And that's just a really handy way of, getting the context around that device as it happened. But it gets a bit better. If I wanted to, I can actually just filter out specifically information about a particular communication protocol. If I want to only look at TCP, I click TCP, and that filters down and reassigns all that statistical information accordingly. I can dismiss that filter just as quickly by clicking that. Right. Let's go back to the breach log, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the model breach log. Right. So what I have here is a list of all the behaviors that added up to an eventual model breach. Okay, so I can see here there's been a couple of connections on port 445, and the mathematics has said an increase in the number of internal IPs connected to. So the mathematics has started to say this is strange behavior, this is anomalous, right? As we see more of these connections on port 445, we see a whole bunch of failures to connect along that port, right? And then afterwards, we see an increase in the internal data accessed. So for this device and for this user, the data accessed at this point in time is strange. Mathematically, it's something we aren't expecting at this point in time. And what happens is, as this behavior becomes more and more abnormal, it eventually amounts to a model breach. And then we see this unusual activity, 67.77%, due to internal data transfer, internal connected devices, and internal connections to closed ports. Now, just from that description, you can probably tell that what this was a port scan. This was malware in its reconnaissance phase, right? So let's just close that. Another really handy thing that we can do is if we collapse that timeline down so it's no longer a 5-minute window, we're looking at a particular moment in time, let's send it back 1 minute and actually have a look at the attack as it takes place. Right. From this machine in the middle of this workstation, we can see we're connected to the main controller. Right. So that's a connection to a file server. None of this is abnormal so far. Until then, that's workstation to workstation communication. This is its lateral movement that malware loves to do as it scans around for network resources and vulnerabilities that it can exploit. Right. So that's pretty bizarre in its own right, but we're not saying it's bad, and that's not why we caught it. We caught it because it's abnormal. Right. So as we keep going along, let's actually open up the event log. So we can see that there's these SMB query failures on 445. Right. So it's going to continue to try to gain access to anything, and there we have a successful path. Right. So it's actually found a way in, it's starting to explore that path, and it's starting to collate all the documentation on that path into one spot for eventual exfiltration. Right. And because that's actually found a file share that it can access, we see an increase in the internal data accessed very quickly there. So as this behavior continues to add up, right, what will happen very quickly after this, right, in about 3 seconds, is it's going to say there was a breach, right? So we see it right there. All right, unusual activity 67.77% due to internal data transfer, internal connected devices, and internal connections to closed ports. Just that quickly. Now, what's really important to notice about this attack is that this was real customer information, right? So we've taken the information from a live network. We've cleaned it, made sure that there's no identifying information actually on the network, and we're using it with their permission. But this was an actual attack, right? And the customer that this was the victim of this attack had a very sophisticated security stack, and it still managed to get through their endpoint, through their IDS, through their firewall, everything like that, through their AV. But it was caught by Darktrace, and it was caught in this very embryonic stage of the attack while it's still in the reconnaissance phase, right? Before any data could actually leave the network, they managed to isolate that workstation and just clean it so there was no malware on it. So when you think that most data exfiltration attacks are on a network for about 200 days before they're discovered, and they're normally discovered by actual data exfiltration, this is the sort of thing that's actually very powerful, that Darktrace does better than anyone else. So if we actually just click on the device summary as well, we just get a quick list of the information, like statistical information about this device very quickly. So we see when was it first seen, when was it last seen. We see a list of similar devices. So we talked about clustering in the presentation. These are the devices that have been clustered with these ones. It's peer group, devices that behave in a very similar way to this device. And then we see just some graphical representations of the ports used, ports served, devices used, devices served, right? So just really handy stuff there.